welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we are beginning our discussion on Bad Mexican, Bad American by Jose Hernandez Diaz. Today we'll be discussing an overview and the first half of the collection.
We're on a roll.
Yay!
Yay, we're back.
We're back.
We're back on the roll.
Back-to-back recordings now.
Mm-hmm.
Episode number 92, I want to say, because I was miscounting the other time because I didn't include the border ones and then the interview.
Oh.
Well, if the internet is like it is, it's, so there's already going to be somebody leaving a comment. Actually, you did your math wrong. You forgot
Right?
They'll be the first to let us know.
Yep.
New book
Yeah.
that we're holding in our hands right now.
This book is from Acre.
Mm-hmm.
We all really liked the cover, which was done by
Jaime Chavez, right? Is that what?
Jamie.
Jamie. I always...
We were just talking about that. Jamie.
It's because I get into like a... Yeah, all right, my bad.
Spotted Vato.
Spotted Vato by Jamie Chavez. That's right.
Yep.
And I texted you guys a link to a piece that spotlights more of the work, so it's worth looking into.
Yeah. Yeah, we've gotten a lot of cool covers in this show, so add it to the list.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should make another reel.
Oh,
one
yeah.
that you did with all the covers.
Oh,
of the
thank
That
you.
was
I
pretty
definitely
fun.
should.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then it's nice to get a shout out to a teacher, right? We don't get that often. So for my high school English teacher, Mrs. Kimberly Weir. And of course, he's dedicating this to his parents. So this is a very big, familia collection, I would say. Maria and Esteban Hernandez.
Oh yeah, that's great mentioning that because he does have a couple of poems that are nice tributes to both his father and mother, and there's even a couple poems about education, which I think pretty cool tie into that.
Yes.
Imagining something that I guess I had an experience. You guys might maybe haven't either.
And I think it's great, to think about what our source of inspiration is. I remember, Richie, you had asked of this of Jose, and I forget what the word that you used, like their... But
I wanted to say I usually say literary role models.
Yeah.
But predecessors, your literary predecessors, your muse, your
Yeah. Because, I think it's important to think about, like, this is a collection that's big on roots, and that includes the roots of, like, our writing. Yeah, and...
he does talk a lot about influences and inspirations throughout,
Yeah.
for sure. Some people I didn't even have a chance to look up yet.
I did, but really briefly, just, I didn't know who James Tate was.
Yeah.
And just, little things like that. But I thought that was really cool, too. Just, it's always a nice activity or exercise for students to think about their inspirations. And
Well, I like the way he does it here, and I think that in turn would be a really fun prompt. Is like, who's your in your graveyard, and how do you leave your respects to them, in terms of like inspirations or. I like how we're starting in the last one.
No, I know.
Yeah.
Let's do it. Border Simulator fried us up, So we're starting at the end and beginning at the end and at the beginning and speaking in smoke signals.
Yeah, and pre-show we were talking about Border Simulator and just how different that book is, which also talks about family and it also talks about things like that, but just so different.
Yeah.
And how it's written and
Yeah, just like the use of language is just very different.
Well, one thing that's highlighted, I think, and I guess we can talk about as we look more in depth. It's more accessible, right? Meaning that there's a lot more plain language, a lot more colloquialisms, references to culture, right? And, not that Border Simulator didn't have that, right? But this is something that you could even maybe. I feel like if I were teaching like freshman English, maybe like, here's some a look into like this poet.
Yeah, like Eddie at Jeff,
That's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
would you say it's like middle diction or low diction? Middle? Somewhere between middle and low.
Yeah, because he also talks about being in between a lot. I think this is also true of that. Like,
Yeah.
um,
And I know with the Spanish, you guys had some things to say about that. But maybe we should save it for like the specific ones.
Sure.
for sure.
Who had the first one here? I want to talk about Familia, but that's like the third one.
Ballad of the West Coast Mexican American Chicanx, where he uses the Mexican ranchera and
I did see last night before I went to bed. I put on I found on YouTube his book release, and he had his mom sing this part.
that's nice.
Yeah. Did some singing, and for him it was also important for him to sing it when he read it out loud. And I think this is actually a theme that shows up quite a bit throughout the pieces. It's this idea of like music and singing, poetry, singing, and like being able to sing. And so in his reading, he kind of emphasized that. And he had his mom come up and sing, which I thought was really sweet. And as far as this, I mean, I don't know. I guess it's maybe a good introduction to what he is and what his style is. He's using a lot of bilingual, right? Language. He kind of what do you say? An acceptance of like cultural norms, like putting ketchup on a breakfast burrito, which most people would. I mean, I don't know. Where do you guys stand on that?
Cringe.
I know people who put ketchup on everything, and I'm like, I don't get it. But I mean, I know maybe you can take up defense in some Cali traditions, Reina, like the burritos come up, like especially Cali burritos. And I'm having a hard time understanding fries, but it sounds good too. And I think if you're craving it, you're craving it.
Like at Inside Out, right, or whatever it's called.
Not inside.
Animal style.
Oh my god.
Chicanx, yeah. I mean, that's all I had. Just an observation about that opening piece.
Yeah, it is. It is kind of just like the intro to him and perceptions of him and being Mexican American in that liminal space, which we've talked about a lot in this podcast. So that was kind of also refreshing, especially because of the title, Bad Mexican, Bad American, immediately brings us to question what is bad and who's saying it's bad. Is it like the self-imposed or, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, culture, identity, like all these things are always so malleable, right? So how we come to those definitions are interesting when we experience it in someone's art. So it is an anxiety, right, of like not knowing what you're supposed to be. I always think we always reference the Selena line, right? We're not Mexican enough for the Mexicans, not American for the Americans,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And definitely one of the themes, right, in this collection is that.
Yeah. Or like even to the effect like sometimes you may have to like do some cultural performativity. So, which maybe you guys picked up on a little bit on this, like sometimes we have to like overdo it to like this is my Mexicanness.
Overcorrect.
Perhaps, Anyway, speaking of overcorrecting, I had to go back and reread this because again, Border Simulator had me reading on the left side of the page. So I was skipping pieces. I'm like, oh, wait a minute. That's this. No wonder I'm totally forgetting about the right side of the page there.
Yeah.
I had the second poem, Doña Ofelia, which I know I said pre-show about. There wasn't a full poem that I wanted to talk about, but I do like this one because it reminded me a lot of my grandma, or the stories I've heard about my grandmother on my mom's side because I didn't know her. She passed 2 months after I was born. But my mom talks about her so much that I feel like I know her and how she was and who she was. And she was this kind of person who, like, they didn't have very much, they were very, very poor. There were 12 of them in the family. But my grandmother, Cesaria, she was always very, like, giving and would give the clothes off of her back if she could, if someone needed it. And anybody who ever asked her for plato de frijoles, she was there to offer.
Yeah.
And so, like, this is kind of one of those voices that's very universal, or can be universal, for these types of, Mexican American families that have that abuelita, that have that person, that, like, barrio legend, in the family. And that part on, I think it was page 5, he talks about, like, how she's even known, like, in other.
I think.
She's Doña Felia is respected by the locals. I don't know if that's the part that I was looking at, but yeah, like, it's just that force, or that woman, in this case, Doña Felia, who is respected and known by everyone, and how giving and kind she was. Anyway,
Yeah.
so that I really enjoyed, because it really reminded me of this grandmother that I never knew, which is kind of weird to say, but
I think a lot of people would feel like that, having that family member who would be the one, like, to feed all the kids on the block. I hear my parents talk about growing up all the time, my mom and all her brothers, and it just reminds me of those types of stories whenever we get together and they talk about, it's that same thing, that someone you maybe hadn't even met but can still, like, experience through their stories.
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And even then, it's like they're wanting to write about her and talk about her, As we sit and chat, he says, "My cousin tells his grandma that I'm a writer and I can write her life story. She lets out a light laugh and says, 'Mi vida ya pasó, mijo.' My life has already passed, son." So it's almost that, like, I'm not worthy of being written in to any stories. It's like, this is just something that should be done, or
Mm-hmm.
and like la humildad that you see from a lot of these people too. Like, no, I'm not doing it for that kind of mentality.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to me, that's definitely my strong line. And yeah, I mean, exactly what you said. I wanted to just tie in this poem to my Chicanic lit class, because they do what I call a familia essay, where they are required to interview a family member, and ideally, like an abuela or abuelo, right? To kind of figure out, like, more about their roots and, like, their life story, because I tell them, like, how else are you going to know, right, if you don't actually sit down and talk to them about that. And so I see that in this poem too, right, because he asks that same question, right? I can write your life story, but I think it's very important in terms of identity to also think about your familia's identity. And so yeah, I mean, there's kind of a meta-ness to this poem that we also see in a lot of other poems in this collection, right? About the poet as the writer, as the chronicler of reality.
Damn. All right. That's the role.
I also wanted to mention one other line in this poem. Something we talked about pre-show was just the idea that this book could work really well for students who are barely being introduced to poetry, or they're not as familiar with poetry. So one line that stood out to me from this one was towards the beginning of the poem. I tell him, "Every time someone tells me they don't like poetry, I ask if they like rap. They say yes. I tell them rap is poetry." And so I think a lot of students see poetry as something that's not really for them. But especially, like, when we tie it into, like, music, especially, like, lyrics and things, it kind of is for everybody. And then there's a collection for everybody to enjoy, I think.
Yeah.
So that line kind of really stood out to me from this poem.
Yeah.
And that's when you bring in Tupac next, right? Rose from Concrete. And,
Yes.
Yeah, it's always seen as, like, high art, or like inaccessible, or like,
Yeah.
We think about the old poets, that were taught to us in high school, part of the canon.
yeah. And that's the perception. And I think that's why I think he talks about, like, having people of color being teachers, like, and reading, like, current authors too, like, and like concerning rap as poetry, to, again, break down that monolith
Yeah.
that maybe you might get if you know, you have certain teachers growing up who are a little older, old school. Think to them, great literature is also just old literature, right?
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Um, also, uh, we talked about this. We talk about this a lot in the podcast, like the handling of language. So in this one, you have an example where he translates at the end, right?
Yes.
What do you think about that, Vanessa?
I feel like I've talked about this on the podcast before too. When authors write in their mother tongue, in most cases on the podcast we talk about Spanish. But they write in Spanish, and then immediately the following line is them translating it to English, which is something that has always bothered me. Because I think, well, this is something that Minerva told me once. Minerva's a professor at EPCC as well. When she writes in Spanish, it's because that's for her people. And so I feel like when authors translate it to English, let's just say, it's to make it more accessible to everybody. But I feel like not everything is for everybody. So especially like when you're writing in your mother tongue, I don't feel like you should have to translate, and your readers, if they are wanting to find out more about what it is you're saying, they can use a translator themselves, and use context clues to figure out what it is you're saying rather than you having to spell it out for them. So yeah, that's just my thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, what about in a situation where you have an abuelo who speaks Spanish and you have a grandkid who's like speaks English more, and so the kid is translating in their head because that's what they're always doing, having to do that in their head, like
Yeah.
go from Spanish to English. So it's kind of replicating that act.
Interesting. That could have been what was happening here.
Yeah.
I mean,
Possibly.
yeah, I kind of have that same reaction as Vanessa, where I just ask why, why include the again, like why? Why include the translation?
Well, I mean, we can ask him on Wednesday.
Yeah. That's going to be my question. Why'd you do that?
Yeah.
And
No, I mean,
there's always different reasons too. Like that's
Yeah.
what's really kind of cool about it is I never thought of it that way, Richie. I think that's a really nice insight into the
mindset.
mindset, but also like code
Code
switching,
switching.
right? That we do constantly and we sometimes don't realize. But now, if that's what's happening here, we see it like on paper.
I also wonder the editor's role, right? Because I know
Right.
sometimes editors can be really pushy,
Yeah.
and maybe
feel
you,
like a lot of the times
Italicize
it
your
is- yeah.
Spanish, or
Yeah, I feel like a lot of times it is like the editors or the publishers that kind of push that, because they want it to be more accessible to English speakers and I guess
More universal.
yeah.
but I think we should push back, but then like there's a risk of then we can't publish it like that, especially like for a first time writer, but.
Yeah, like I mean, I'm thinking about past books that we've read, like Randy Rabai. Like, did he do a lot of translating of
He
the
didn't translate
Tagalog?
anything.
So we had to do that. Same with the hunger. Always, what did the hunger one?
Oh, Some Are Always Hungry.
Some are always hungry. Yeah, like she did. She didn't do some translations either. I think some she did. I remember we had to look up a lot though. So that's also kind of
Yeah.
like the act of reading, right? Like the
Yeah.
interpretation. Like if you really want to go, you have to like go and like look up definitions and fit it back in the context.
But it's interesting too because our last two works have been works that included a translation in it.
Yeah.
So,
And both works were kind of also bilingual. Like it would have English and Spanish anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, the approaches are all different. Yeah. But I was just thinking about that right now. It's like, especially like in second, third generation Mexican Americans, they grow up in the U.S. feeling the pressure to speak English more.
Yeah.
Or like that's what their friends speak, or like again maybe there's like pressure to assimilate, not simulate, but this time just assimilate.
yeah.
And I was thinking that too. If I were writing about my family experience, my grandparents would be speaking Spanish, and I'd be trying to translate in my head in English. You know what they're saying,
Mm.
which is weird, but that's
Yeah.
a gap.
I think there's also a poem in this collection that kind of talks about that, just like this pressure to speak more English.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Is it Bad Mexican, Bad American? Maybe that one.
I don't think so.
Or broken.
I think it's
Oh,
broken.
Does it
Yeah.
call- Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think you had the next poem though, right?
Yeah.
Emilia?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, just real briefly, again, the emphasis on the theme of familia in this collection, which I, of course, resonate a lot with because of my students writing, the familia essay, but also just, of course, the importance of familia in my own family. But I liked also that a lot of these poems do reflect a kind of working class philosophy. The line here, my siblings all went to college, but we know that true education lies in your roots. Yeah, and I think that's important to think about in terms of like what is like true education, and what is it that we learn from our familia, right? Well, we learn customs, we learn rituals, and like this is something that I try to emphasize in my Chicana Lit class, that I don't really get too much into with my other classes. So yeah, that's what, and it's after Ray Gonzalez, who I looked up is actually an El Paso poet. So kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think that was something that I found interesting, that even though Jose is from California, there's a lot of El Paso references in this
Yeah.
collection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
There's a lot of odes in this collection too. Some are odes that are not, blatantly like in the title, right? But some do have that ode to whatever in the title.
I mean, Ode to Overlooked Minimalist Painting could be like an underdog in this entire collection, right?
Mm-hmm.
'Cause he says the best art is that which is overlooked and underappreciated, a minimalist painting that is thought to be simple or bland.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I, for one, hate minimalist
Yeah.
art.
Hmm.
I don't understand, when there's like a big old painting, it's just like the color red and it's like
Rothko called out.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
millions of dollars. Like,
Yeah.
why?
Yeah.
I
Again,
think
why?
especially because you see like stuff that takes more craft and talent, and that is often overlooked. If you're thinking about that too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
I mean, the market for art's always a confusing one, right? Who has the deep pockets is the real question. That's.
oh,
But I like this piece because I mean I like how he just discusses this reading where it's like empty and no one shows up, and how even that can be like a very like beautiful experience with people just talking and sharing some wine and poetry like that. That's legit. That's dope.
Mm-hmm.
yeah. I did write for this one the beauty and simplicity, minimalism, or in the mundane.
Mm-hmm.
Like it seemed like that's kind of what he was getting at. Maybe not actually minimalist painting, or maybe. Well, I wouldn't think so because he has such a cool cover, and he's showing like this. Some might think this is minimalistic, but it does have so much more symbolism behind it too. So
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
anyway.
And maybe this is a good time to talk about the, we're talking about how like a lot of these poems work really well for like the freshman English class, the intro to poetry or intro to lit. And we talked pre-show about how a lot of these works seem to be workshopped, or like there's a prompt behind them, right? Like in this one, also kind of just based on like the like everyday experiences, right? Like being tagged on Twitter, or things like that, right? And there's a lot of these like very meta poems that he's specifically looking for something that it's almost like he's provoking the poem, by having whatever experience, right? And I think that's notable. I don't know. I know you guys had thoughts about that, but
We have a lot of thoughts.
like, I keep
We
getting
all
called
have
out.
thoughts.
What's
I know.
up?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that if we look at like the templates or the prompts that he's using for some of his poetry, like it's kind of cool because again, students don't have to start from scratch. Like you can be like, okay, think about someone who walks into a bar and he's wearing a specific kind of shirt. What shirt is he wearing? And what happens? What does he do? And you have to include like a really surrealist moment, one line, and then go, you know? So instead of students have to like, what do I write a poem about? Like you're giving them direction, and so that's always kind of nice to have, and a lot of his poems do have that. So that was my thought.
Yeah.
Are we still talking about the ode or a different one now?
I think we can move along.
Yeah.
If you had more.
No.
Did anyone have my father never ate until everyone had eaten?
I like that one. I mean, I didn't have any.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I like that one too. Again, it kind of goes back to like Doña Ofelia and like sacrifices that were made, and sometimes as kids we might not notice what's happening, you know, in the background, or might have an idea about like what it takes to survive or to grow up in the United States. And like here he kind of shows us that, you know, his father was like, no, you guys eat, and like how his mindset changed. And at first he's like, I hated it, I wanted my dad to eat with us, and why wasn't he doing it, you know? So like those thoughts and like anger, but then when he realized it was because he wanted to make sure that the kids were all, you know, satisfied and fed, that's why he wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
So it was a very lovely poem in that sense.
That was a good tribute.
Seems also like an homage to My Papa's Waltz, or Robert Hayden's Those Winter Sundays. You know, about like how in retrospect the father was showing love, right? Because in Those Winter Sundays it ends with like the love as like a lonely, austere office. And here it's like an ineffable love.
I did like the mirroring of broken and my mother's broken English, pages 10 and 11. I liked that they were placed side by side, and that he shows like how his father treats the language versus his mother's, and that choice of having broken in parentheses on the mother's side. So lots of different things happening in these two poems that I appreciated.
Yeah, this would be a good pairing to teach.
True. I the end of Broken reminded me of Jose Olivares' end of Orto Tortilla. Like, but they'll probably want McDonald's anyway. And here, you know, he's like, we turn up the Lakers game. What's the score anyway? Kind of that deferment.
You were talking about this one earlier, no, Vanessa?
Yeah, but I feel like I said what I had to say.
Oh, okay. You're good. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I think for a lot of like second and third generation, like in my house specifically, Spanglish is not allowed. Like if you're speaking Spanish, you're speaking Spanish, and if you're speaking English, you're speaking English. I think that's ultimately why I lost a lot of my Spanish, because Spanish was my first language, but like today, like I don't know a lot of the words in Spanish. And so this one kind of reminded me of that, just in the idea that the father was telling him he needed to stop speaking Spanish because it was so bad, and to focus more on speaking only English. And I think that happens in a lot of second and third generation kids.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that one's more like about the loss of language, and then my mother's broken English starts. My mother's broken English is more beautiful than a Neruda poem. So it's like that acceptance, but not only acceptance of like praising, like you were saying, Jorge. This broken English from his mother's side sounds magical in prayer, like totally different tone.
And it's also then elevating it, right? Versus like Neruda, whom many consider like one of the greatest poets, and now you get the elevation of like the quote unquote broken English.
Romanticizing it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I thought those were cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't understand the pocha with the Adelita tattoo. The part where, I mean, he's calling her a pocha,
Mm-hmm.
but then he says, I don't know if she speaks Spanish. If she does, it's probably broken like mine. So is the pocha because he's just assuming she is? It just felt weird.
I thought it was a weird one too. The ending threw me out.
Yeah.
There's maybe like a stereotype there, right? Like the kind of person. But
There were a couple of those. The other with the jaguar tattoo later.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But again, like the repetition of like these, I felt like they were character studies. It's like, okay, now it's a woman and she has this tattoo. Now it's a man and he has this tattoo. And like, how do we develop these characters differently?
And it's kind of what you were saying too, right? About like some of these sound like they could work better as stories.
Well, I think, especially like in a lot of my creative writing classes, I was told to show and not tell. And I just felt like a lot of the poems could have had some more descriptions, or I guess like more details, more images. I felt like there was a lot of abstract terms that could have been turned into images. And I feel like there was like not a whole lot of use of the five senses. There's a lot of like sight, but there's not a lot of like sound. So like songs and bands are mentioned, but it's not really described, I guess. Foods are mentioned, but what do they taste like and what do they smell like? And I felt like a lot of that was kind of missing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of goes back to like the minimalist nature in a lot of these poems, where, yeah, I mean, it's almost like like pulling teeth, right? With having to kind of extract more images, but the poet just kind of leaves it and is like very terse sometimes.
And anytime I see stuff like this, I ask my students, well, why, I'll ask them, why do you think these details were left out? There must be something else that they're trying to emphasize, if that's the case, So then we kind of pivot and start thinking about it in those terms. And so I tried doing that with some of these that I felt also kind of just left off or left me with more questions. Like, okay, what is being said with what I have here in front of me? What is it that I'm supposed to be focusing on? Like that one image, that one line, and a lot of times it was that just like one line that really stood out to me. From some of these poems that had me kind of thinking further, which kind of goes against what we were saying earlier about it being minimalist and like not leaving a lot to our imagination. It's kind of doing the opposite because of how simple some of these seem, that now we start questioning like choices and thinking about them more. And so I don't know if that's like the poet's way of making us work for it. I don't know, maybe I'll ask.
And then we get a couple of prose poems, and this is a collection that's heavy with them, right? And I would say like he's one of the most, like he's one of the writers that I think publishes the most prose poems that I know of. And so I think it's interesting kind of thinking about the kind of going back to like the prompt behind a lot of these works, right? And how 14 Here Folk Song begins with that, a man in an X shirt, and then kind of like you were saying, Reina, that we get an image or some kind of complication or something, right? And it just kind of ends with like the resolution, right, or whatever.
Sometimes there's resolution, but not always.
That Anyone have La Paleta or something before that on 17?
Has anyone ever done that writing prompt? The paleta one? Paleta prompts?
I haven't actually. What's the prompt?
No, I don't know. I just
What's the
I
prompt?
I was asking you to fill in the gap there. Yeah.
I did a similar one in Yasmin's class, kind of, I think.
Well, that's what I was thinking of. Yasmin does something like that.
Yeah, with pan dulce.
Yeah.
So she brings like I think it's like the first or second week of her creative writing classes.
Mm-hmm.
She brings a bag of different kinds of pan dulce, and everyone gets to pick one, and then they have to write a poem or a story based on the one that they picked.
Mm.
And so that kind of made me think of that.
Mm. Well, yeah, and aside from that, like whole paleta thing, what I liked about this one was going back to like how the axis, right? The axis route for a lot of these works is like pop culture or like just something that isn't like what we think of as high art. And so in this case, it's Rage, right? And so the speaker mentioned like Rage got me into poetry. If it weren't for Rage and a few influential teachers, I never would have pursued literature. And so this is another one where I think our students could definitely relate, when we try to like have them think about what is a poem, what is literature.
We skipped it, but go back to the one folk song on page 14. I want to give a shout out to Las Cafeteras. They're some homies. They're based out of LA, of course, but a little while back they were on a South by Southwest tour, and I went to a show of theirs that they had at the San Carlos building downtown, and yeah, they were cool. We hung out, and I ended up offering my apartment for them to stay the night. So like all 8 of them cramped up in there, and we stayed up telling stories and like ghost stories, all sorts of cool stuff. So it's really fun to see them show up in a book of poems. If you guys haven't had a chance to check them out, listeners, I definitely recommend. They have a couple albums now. Yeah, I think when they visited my spot, their first album was out, and then they have like 2 or 3 more out now. Pretty cool stuff. I like what they do. Yeah, so I just want to give a shout out to them.
Yeah,
I think I would have like going back to this poem and all the other poems that have that same template. Like, would have liked to see the bands or their music kind of incorporated more into the poem.
Yeah,
because it was just like an afterthought that it just happened to be wearing a Las Cafeteras shirt.
Right.
And the Ramon Ayala thing, like, oh, Ramon Ayala, I love. Like, why not include lyrics or something, in that poem? Because really, if you change Las Cafeteras shirt to any other shirt, Ramon Ayala to any other singer, like, it's not going to change the poem.
Right. Yeah.
And for La Paleta, it again, same thing here. I did like that he did incorporate just, that connection between music and poetry and inspiration and drawing from that. So this one was a lot different. This is kind of what I hoped to see more when those bands were named. Especially as a music lover, you're like, oh yeah, Rage. And then talks a little bit about, okay, cool. And then Ramon Ayala, and then there's not really much
like the
else
details.
mentioned. Yeah, those details.
Like maybe a specific song that like really impacted them.
Right. And then I know you liked or wanted to talk about My Name on 18.
Oh yeah. I liked this one just on the idea of names and their significance, and I feel like this is something we've talked about on the podcast before. I think with the first book we ever did, Poet X, I think it was one of the poems in there that Xiomara had talking about her name and just like the significance. And I know a lot of students at the college have essays similar to this that they have to do, kind of analyzing their name, talking to family members and finding out the significance, like if they were named after somebody. So this one kind of stood out to me in that sense. And then I guess because the beginning of this poem kind of starts out with the assimilation and wanting to feel more American. But then kind of seeing, like after figuring out like the Spanish customs and everything, just feeling more connected to their name and the significance of their name. Yeah, I don't know. I really like this one and tying it into like that writing assignment or that writing prompt of like the significance of names.
Mm-hmm.
It's going back to identity and
Mm-hmm.
how, or the importance of it, the importance of our name to establish our identity, to feel more Mexican in this case.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I like that he mentions MySpace name because
Mhm.
some of us can
Yeah.
relate.
Well, that's when things are official, right?
Mhm.
We know that once it's online. It's,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I don't think he ever wanted to go by Joey. That's what people called him.
Mm-hmm.
Says people call me that. um, I do think it's yeah. No, I think it's cool. I think this is one of the really solid poems in this entire section here.
Mm-hmm.
Jose Hernandez Diaz choosing the double names, right? And I don't know. We talk about the accent marks, and we've talked about that previous episode, I believe, right?
I think so.
Borderline,
Yeah.
Hmm.
Or the ñ, like in our
Mhm.
case.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Go on to section 2. Or wait, no.
Yeah.
Are we mixing the title poem?
Yeah, I feel like we can't skip the title poem. I guess the biggest thing in this one is just like the internal conflict
Mm.
that probably a lot of Mexican Americans feel. And Richie, you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier from Selena. Just not being Mexican enough for the Mexicans and not American enough for the Americans, and kind of trying to find the balance of both, like maintaining both, but also being proud of each one individually, I guess.
Mm-hmm. It's also generational, right? Because he says, my children will likely speak less Spanish than me.
Hmm.
So there's kind of a diminishing return of like more gradual loss of roots as well.
Yeah. The emphasis on like bad, I think is interesting. I would have initially thought maybe it even would have like ties into maybe like Catholic guilt or something like,
Hmm.
but there's not a whole lot of that in the entire collection. So maybe that's what's not there.
Yeah.
But
Mm.
I thought,
I like the last line. How do you want to be remembered? Just that reflection, and how just that's kind of a question that we've heard so many times in our lives about like what legacy we want to leave behind.
Mhm.
And when he talks about generations, like you were saying, Jorge, with his children, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's also a choice, right? Like, why would his parents speak or his children speak less Spanish? I mean, you could change that and
Mhm.
have them relearn yourself. But instead, it's kind of just like it's bound to happen. We're gonna lose that language.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, just like the title, Bad Mexican, Bad American, it is an acknowledgement. It kind of gives off that like complacency, like, it is what it is, instead of trying to be like, no, well, I can be a good Mexican or a bad Mexican according to you, but I'm still going to root for Mexico. I'm still going to put ketchup on my scrambled eggs. I'm still going to,
Mm-hmm.
do these things as who I am, and I'm still Mexican American,
Mhm.
right? And claim that or reclaim it.
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Hmm.
I do think this is a fitting end for the first section because I do think that the first section is like primarily like linear poetry and prose where it's more or less straightforward. It has to do with a lot of identity, culture, more straightforward. I do think that with the second part onward, it gets more surrealist.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's an interesting choice to almost like this last poem is the invocation to the next pieces, like
Mm.
where he gets to explore more of like the surrealist aspects of what he does as a writer. I don't know. What do you think about the surrealism that Jose brings to the table here in this next section? Okay.
I mean, it was interesting having the conversation about this pre-show. Because you guys make a good point about the how it kind of leaves off, and maybe we needed something more. Like for example, like on 27, Insomniac Moon, we get this kind of surrealist image of like this man who's can't sleep, and like it's the moon so bright, And the moon kind of suggests, well, just listen to music and that'll help. So he does, right? And then it says, in a matter of minutes, he fell asleep. The moon, too, eventually disappeared. So from a surrealist perspective, there is that, the personification of the moon and such. But a lot of these in this section like this, that like you kind of are left wondering, well, what else? Like kind of think, like my question, well, what am I supposed to make of this? Like, is there something that I missed?
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
So let's say you have someone right now listening to this podcast who's not too familiar. You kind of hinted at it in your discussion right now, but like what would be surrealism, especially like in writing?
Yeah. I mean, so I was kind of assuming that people would know that, but yeah, it's a good question. So surrealist lit and I think art, gives us something that makes us think about, question reality, right? We question whether what we're seeing or hearing or whatever, sensing is actually taking place. And so it is kind of a way of thinking about like fantasy, except that it's also in a way like magical realist, right? Because you're grounded in some, like, it seems plausible, but it's also like things you see in dreams, right? And so that's to me what surrealism is in a nutshell.
Yeah, like anything that's based in reality may be presented in an absurd way or almost like dreamlike or fantastical, like Jorge was saying. That's kind of how I see surrealism, surrealistic elements. And so, again, pre-show we were talking about like that imagery and how some of these lines are just like really cool because they hook you, right? I saw Quetzalcoatl at Panda Express in the city. That's how the first line of that line is like, oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
What happened? How did that come to play? So, some of these images are really cool and things that you would expect in poetry because poetry allows you that freedom. Yeah.
But it's also kind of going back to your point about the minimalism and minimalist art is like it's mundane, right? Like it's banal. Like there's nothing like there's like no battle or like something like there's not a lot of conflict. It's very like understated. And so I really kind of want to ask him about that. Is like why not maybe kind of switch it up? Like some of these other poems can go a different direction. Because they all kind of follow that pattern, the prose poems, at least to me.
I liked The Road on page 35, not to be confused with Cormac McCarthy.
Oh, man. Imagine.
Jorge's like, I wish.
Right.
I liked this one for several reasons. I think because it did stick to that like surrealist vibe throughout, I was lost somewhere in the Bay Area. I saw a sign that said, "Take this road." I took the road straight ahead and didn't look back. After a couple of hours, I was in a land of nothing but my past and dreams. My deceased grandfather rode by on his mule on his way to work the fields. I saw Chick Hearn calling a basketball game between two of my friends who passed away from drugs. I kept driving. Next, I saw my elementary school teacher, Mrs. Cranford, baking banana nut bread on Christmas Eve. I wanted to try the bread. It smelled so good. But I didn't want to get out of the car because I thought I might disappear. Later, I saw some dinosaurs up ahead, and I knew it was time to stop. I sat in the car until my dreams consumed me. I was never even born. Like, I think that one just kind of resolves in itself, and that one to me did feel finished. I liked these ghosts and the road and that symbolism too. And the dinosaurs, because in California, there's some really famous dinosaur sculptures in Southern California. And so that reminded me of, again, like rooted in reality. So it sounds like it could be surreal, but it's also like, oh, those dinosaurs do exist and are there on that road. So this one I enjoyed. If you ever saw Pee-wee's Big Adventure, is that what it's called?
Yeah.
The dinosaurs come out in that movie. He's riding with Large Marge, Have you seen it?
Yeah. That's one
Okay.
movie I have seen, oddly enough.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I do remember that part, though.
And at this point, I'm asking. I mean, I wrote in my notes. Are these dreams? Are these scenarios? Are these what ifs? Like plots that he's coming up with on his own, where he's meeting Octavio Paz on the planet Jupiter.
Mm-hmm.
My life as a French existential novelist.
Mm-hmm.
Wolverine on Hollywood Boulevard, like different things, that again, like following these templates, it's like, okay, he has to come up with a character and he has to place them somewhere and now create a story for them. So I'm wondering like how he came up with that template. That was my biggest question, I guess. My date with Frida Kahlo, meeting James Tate in heaven. So it's always like a known, well, not always, known people, artists, characters, and placing them somewhere and then developing that scene.
Mm-hmm. And it's either like literary figures or like artists as well, right? Frida or, yeah.
Or Mesoamerican gods, different ones there too. Are there any final thoughts on parts 1 and 2? I think we pretty much covered covered a lot.
Yeah, I think we'll leave it for the next episode, right?
Yeah. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Literally Literary, recorded at Power at the Past and brought to you by Border Senses. This episode, we began our discussion on Bad Mexican, Bad American by Jose Hernandez Diaz. If you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Join us on our next episode and follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep.